Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today in this last talk I'm releasing for 2024. And today I have the privilege of diving into an amazing, enriching, heartfelt conversation with Jarod K. Anderson, famously known as the Crypto Naturalist. And maybe you've been following him on Instagram or read some of his book. And if you haven't, I really recommend. This is some of the best soul felt work that is so needed in this time of winter that we are going through. So in this talk, I'll explore Jarod's connection with nature, beginning with his experience during childhood nature walks in Ohio, which eventually led to his emergence as a beloved voice in poetry and mental health advocacy. So Jarod is the creator and voice behind the Crypto Naturalist podcast, and he has authored several best-selling collections of poetry, including Field Guide to the Hunted Forest and Something in the Woods Loves You. His work beautifully combines imaginative wonder with personal insights, making the natural world a source of inspiration and solace. And you probably understand why I'm so excited of this discussion with Jarod and why I love his work so much, because I feel a lot of the way I connect to nature and relate and been sharing with you for so many years is so intertwined in the way Jarod also sees this world. So as you listen, I share how his journey unfolded from the woods to the world of words. Jarod candidly opens up about his experience too, about ADHD and chronic depression, and the liberating power of vulnerability and creative expression. There is something really profound in the words that Jarod will share with us. So I hope this conversation inspire you. And if you are seeking authentic stories of resilience, empathy, and hope, I'm sure you're going to love this discussion. So join me as we explore the journey of the Crypto Naturalist. And I hope in this talk you find how creativity and the natural world really meet. And I wanted to wish all of you a beautiful end of the year, beautiful holidays as we are leading into the solstice, or maybe as you listen, the solstice just passed. And I thank you so much for being here with you. Okay, let's dive in. How do you navigate the losses, the heartbreak, with the depths of the empathy and the connection and the depression that is lingering?
The best word I have for it is honesty. I'm going to tell my son the truth as best I can about the flawed human animal and, where we've lost wisdom and how injustice is alive and well and self-serving ignorance. And, there are things we can do. But as somebody who struggles with major chronic depression, the thing I have to come back to again and again is accepting what I do and do not control. There's a lot of room for grief and there's a lot of room for anger in my life, but I also have to extend some empathy to myself and take some time to say, all right, acknowledge what you do and don't control, and acknowledge that the good in the world and the evil in the world are always happening simultaneously. But something about my love of nature and my understanding that I'm a part of nature says, all right, but I am also worthy of moments of wonder and love and joy and peace. And in a world where all of this information is available simultaneously, it's going to take an act of intention to say that sometimes I need to turn toward the good and the peaceful and the things that should be witnessed and loved. And that sometimes turning toward the good is itself an act of defiance against the evil and the losses and the grief.
So welcome everyone. Excited to have you back on the show here on our podcast and our YouTube channel. And today I'm with Jarod Anderson. Hello, Jarod. How are you?
Hi, dear. Thanks for having me. I'm doing well.
And you might know him through his very moving I don't know, soul striking, heart opening Instagram, the Crypto Naturalist. And if you don't, please rush out there, and there'll be a link under this talk about it, or maybe through one of his beautiful book that I mentioned in the introduction. And I discovered you, Jarod, through your Instagram. Someone sent me a little snippet of what something you wrote, and I was like, this is pure honey for my soul, and I loved it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Started following it, and so I'm really excited to have you here today. So before we dive into some of the topics that I want to discuss, you seem to have a quite intimate relationship with nature, something that probably has been here for a long time, but I would love you to share about, do you remember your first deep connection to nature, or when you were very little, what is the moment that there was one thing that was it, that was something very special for you?
Yeah. So one of my earliest memories, probably when I was 4, 5, I used to go on daily nature walks with my mother. I grew up in rural Ohio, sort of surrounded by woodlands, and every day we would take a walk down a long path, and my mom would talk about, which spring ephemerals were blooming or uses for different plants. Jewel weed is one that I remember that we would talk about for itch and poison ivy rash. And um, it was just my first sense of kind of meaning making out in the world, or sacredness, or my parents. We had no particular affinity for religion in my household growing up. We weren't church people, although we were surrounded by church people in rural America. Um, but in terms of the family character, I just had a long sense that that came from the woods, and what we found there and what we brought to the woods.
Hmm. And did you feel at that time that this was going to be maybe a vocation? I mean, maybe not at 5 year old, but when was the time where at some point you felt like, okay, this might be it? And maybe the writing came, at that time too. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would say that I don't think I knew that there was a vocation possible in it for a long time. Um, I do have a very early memory of when I started writing nature poetry, and I had a very inspirational teacher. I was 10, so that would have been the fifth grade, a woman named Miss Woolard. And I'm not sure if you could do this today, but she used to take this group of 10-year-olds out behind the school, and there was this big hill covered with a forest, and the school called it the Land Lab. And she would tell this group of 10-year-olds, just go find a place to sit and write what you see, look closely. And she would read nature poets to us. She would read Mary Oliver and Robert Frost. And um, so it's funny, I have a very definitive memory of when I first started writing poetry about nature, and then I just kind of never stopped. Um, but the idea that that would somehow be tied to my job came much, much later.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So, yeah, it's interesting because I remember kind of around the same time, maybe sixth or seventh grade, Professor Sogor was doing the same thing for me at school and taking us in the forest. It was every Wednesday afternoon, looking for animal footprints and birds' feathers, and taking a drop of the water from the pond and putting in a microscope to see all the life that was there. And for me, that was the hook. So there's something
Mm,
interesting there. And yeah, now we don't really let the kids out, and it's too dangerous to be in the forest, right? But I hope it still exists in some ways.
me too.
Um, so before we go into you becoming a writer, a poet, writing this beautiful book, did you explore another career, or did it was just flow from there and that was it? This is what I'm going to do, or do you be like everybody? No, you need to get a real job, and work somewhere in an office.
Yeah. So, I went to college when I was 18, mostly because my friends were going, and I struggled with ADHD and chronic depression. And dyslexia, and I decided college wasn't for me. And I left and I ended up working in construction for a while. And it wasn't until my mid 20s that I started taking classes at night again because I've always loved words and been a book nerd. And um, eventually that lured me back into academia when I was a bit older. And I ended up getting a bachelor's in English and then a master's in literature. And I was accepted to a couple PhD programs and was about to do that. But by that time, I had taught college English for a while and knew more about what that job was. And as much as I loved writing and reading, I did not love grading 300 essays by people who did not want to write them, you know. So so I went off and it's like, all right, I want to do something with language. I want to make connections with this love of words. So I ended up working for various nonprofits. I worked at a botanical gardens. I worked at a wildlife rescue, doing grant writing. Um, and I eventually found myself back in academia, working for Ohio University as a director of marketing and fundraising, that kind of thing. And it was at that time that I really reached a low point in my mental health. And the book I just published this year, Something in the Woods Loves You, is really about hitting that low point and realizing that I needed to return to my roots a bit with a love of nature and a love of expressing myself through language.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, your writing already moved me, and especially those parts. So, we were sharing that offline before the recording, but I also experienced, chronic depression for, as long as I can remember in my life. I felt for me the roots are very deeply ingrained with uh deeply feeling what's going on in nature and in the world, and constantly somehow being part of the forest or as the river or the land. So can we talk a little bit about this part of your life, this chronic depression? Because I know a lot of people suffer from that today. In fact, that's probably one of the big epidemic in the world.
Yeah.
Most people find either no solution and go, into addictions and alcohol and drugs and or highly medicated people, right? So what was the point for you where you kind of became aware of it? Because I guess it's not always something that's very well diagnosed in our world also.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I grew up in a context where it wasn't okay to discuss. There was definitely a stigma around talking about mental illness. Um, and I somehow internalized this idea that, I could talk about physical maladies of the body. I could talk about a broken ankle, but I could not talk about lingering despair or suicidal ideology. That these topics were off the table. And so I was in my, late 30s, I suppose, when I really started to find myself in a place to acknowledge it and name it and start getting help for it and start to face it head on. And and then I went and got a chronic major depression diagnosis. Um, and just having words for it began to help. Um, One reason I wrote the memoir was I started posting all of this poetry that was, yes, about nature and wonder and a celebration for the natural world, but also trying to be very open and vulnerable about my own mental health struggles. And it just really opened up this wellspring of messages from people who wanted to talk to me about it and who had things in common with me. Um, and I would answer all of them. And I would say to my wife, each of these folks, I want to take them on a camping trip. I want to have a long talk with them. Um, and so it became this idea for this book started to around our house be called The Long Talk that I wanted to have. And I had written up an outline for this book and had written the first few chapters, and then just a spark of luck in the universe, a publisher contacted me and asked if I had ever thought about writing nonfiction. And I could say, well, here's an outline, and here's the first 5 chapters of this book I'd like to write. Um, but I did it because, I've suffered in silence for so long, and I feel like in terms of my struggles, I've started to have some things to say. I'm careful because I don't want to universalize things that work for me, and I don't want to tell people. One of my big fears with this book was I never wanted to say to somebody, "Go touch a tree and you'll feel all better." I often touch a tree and feel better, but I also wanted to be careful not to
Mm,
say that, hey, I've figured it out for everybody, because, in a big, magical, diverse world like ours, I didn't want to have anyone think that I was being too prescriptive with their path. Um, but I also wanted to very much share some things that worked for me. Um, Slip of the tongue there with shame. Shame was one of the main things I wanted to discuss in the book, because that was one of the things that I felt like I really had to throw off before I could talk about it honestly. And as somebody who loves writing and words and sometimes feels like my power is in metaphor, I'll just give you one example. Something I wanted to share was this idea I settled on of brain weather, which really harmonized with my love of nature and my struggles in my own internal landscapes. And I constantly feel guilty about being sad, or I'd be ashamed about having depression. And when I started to think of my own mental health as brain weather, it was really helpful, because the metaphor went like this: if I planned a picnic and it was ruined by a thunderstorm, I could be disappointed, but I wouldn't be ashamed. Well, why wouldn't I be ashamed? Well, because I don't control the weather. I didn't invite the storm. It's a natural phenomenon. It doesn't mean me harm. And it struck me, well, how is depression any different? It's a natural, widely observed phenomenon. I didn't invite it, I don't steer it. So I think I can be disappointed about a rough depression day, but why should I bring shame into the equation?
mm. Thank you for bringing that. Do you think, Jared, there is obviously there is a definitely a stigma on mental health? This is considered very often as, people are broken and not well, and people should be not experiencing those weathers, right?
Yeah.
Do you think it's very cultural? Do you think also that there is a different kind of stigma when it comes to men's and mental health in general?
Yeah, I do think so. Both points. I mean, I think we have this deep cultural love of productivity. Um, and so any struggle with mental health or meaning making or any interiority in our lives sometimes, I think, is seen as adversarial to this obligation to be constantly productive. And I think that's part of the stigma, at least in the US, I know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then men, certainly. I think there is this strong cultural pressure to have men be kind of unfeeling engines of productivity. And I think the culture that frames those expectations is also very suspicious of empathy for each other, certainly, but also for ourselves. Um, and, I often think of my love of nature as an extension of that empathy, because I see myself in so much of the natural world. And then an extension from that is imaginative empathy, seeing myself in people whose life experiences don't necessarily mirror mine. And that makes the world a richer, deeper place, but it also complicates the world. And if your job is to get people, being kind of quiet and productive, then I think those sorts of ideas are a threat.
Mm. Suspicious empathy. Can we
Yeah.
explore that a little bit? What do you mean by that? I think I understand what you're meaning here.
Suspicious of
It's
empathy?
very
Yeah.
real.
Well, you know, I think empathy often involves trying to put on other people's perspectives. Um, and for me, it's not just people. It could be a river valley or a maple tree. Um, and a lot of the pressures I've gotten from the working world as I've matured, is just, hey, what is important is that you show up, that you don't rock the boat, that you stay on task. Um, and anything like empathy is sort of, I think, seen as a superfluous tangent. Like, don't be imaginative in that way. What are you doing? Like, self-interest is the engine that keeps you coming back again and again to the office when, the high ideal is sort of greed and productivity. And I think that becomes very, uh, well, it's just a context that doesn't invite things like imaginative empathy. Um, and that's part of that pressure on men, I think, kind of uniquely. Whereas as a culture, the culture I know, the culture I was raised in, seemed to shuffle off empathy on women. Like, okay, you be in charge of feelings and childcare. My wife tells stories from her. She has an office job, and she'll be like, men will come in and just sit down and start talking to me about their feelings. People I don't even know that very, very well, and she has this impression of, it's like, hey, you're a woman. Here's some feeling things. Solve this for me. Um, in a way that feels very gendered to her, I think.
Mm,
But I definitely experienced it growing up too. I mean, one example is, I remember the amount of pushback I got once. I had to miss football practice because I won a state poetry contest. So I didn't fit in comfortably in the sort of models I was meant to emulate.
mm,
Um, but it's interesting. I have found, as I was saying about the motivation behind the memoir, uh, when people message me about mental health, I think men specifically will come at it in a more circuitous kind of way. But an interesting observation I have made is that somehow men are often discouraged about expressing an emotional connection to much of the world. But there is a certain school of thought that I think still has a place in America that says that nature is an exception. That that I think men are allowed to be emotional about nature in kind of an old Robert Frost Thoreau kind of way that is a gateway, I think, for some men to connect with their emotion through love of the natural world. And I think that's an opportunity um, for people like me to say, I agree with you. Now let's extend that. Let's
mm.
explore our emotions, about more than just how we feel when we see a sunrise.
Yeah, I was like, is that an experience to, high sports and trekking and hiking in the mountain,
Yeah.
like, the masculine version of connecting to nature, or, and I hate saying that, but the feminine experience of more feeling more deeply and opening our hearts, where I feel like men will be like, this is like a girly thing, or you're like a hippie, or you're a tree hugger, all those name calling
Yeah.
for when we do that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think one can be a gateway for the other.
Mhm.
Because I've known many men who are very obsessed with what is okay culturally for them to do. Um, but I had a friend once who was interested in deer hunting, and he once said to me that it didn't matter that much when he would sit out in a tree stand if he managed to hunt a deer or not. What mattered was the feeling he got when he felt it shift from night to morning in the woods. And I thought to myself, like, okay, now you've got it.
Mm,
Like, whatever gets you out there. Like, I think being out in nature, I think for me, is a path to a deeper connection to your own emotions, whether it's intentional or not sometimes.
mm. Yeah, I think we all crave for feeling more deeply
Mm.
ourselves, the world, each other's nature. It doesn't really matter what it is. And I don't know, personally, I feel that, and I would love to kind of bounce back to that to you, but that this impossibility to really feel that deeply in the cultural context of our society, of jobs and productivity, of being a man, is part of what is entangled in chronic depression in general in men, especially because there is no space to be that sensitive, to be that
Yeah.
kind of men. I mean, probably more real men than the men we've defined in our world, right?
Yeah, I agree. And it feels like a tragedy too, because I certainly haven't beaten depression. It lives with me. But to extend that brain weather metaphor, now I have better ways to dress for the stormy days. I have more tools. I have more ways to build shelter. And I think, I don't dwell on it long, but I think, all right, well, what if I could have had more open discussions about these feelings since I was a little kid? How much further along the path of building that tool set and understanding how to build shelters would I be? Um, and that culturally enforced silence, whoever it serves, it does not serve me. It does not serve anyone struggling with mental health issues. Um, and I have a 5-year-old son, and so I'm constantly thinking about how to talk to him about his own emotions.
Mm.
Um, and, I read books on gentle parenting and I try to do my research but I do sometimes feel like I'm a little bit at sea of thinking, all right, there are a lot of mistakes I've seen in how I was raised in the world, and this is an opportunity to try to undo some of that harm that I found in my own life.
Mm. Yeah, and so I would love to talk about your writing. Maybe you can read something to us from one of your book, and we can start by that if you have something you want to share. And then I'd love to hear about how do you write when you are in nature? How does that come? And what's your process a little bit? And do you consider yourself like spiritual in that aspect of things? Like you feel like you're connecting something that's way beyond the visible? And maybe we can weave on that after that. But yeah, do you have something you want to read to us? And please mention
Sure.
which book you're also reading from, so people
I'm
can.
gonna I'm gonna reach back to my poetry collection, Field Guide to the Haunted Forest.
Mm,
Um, and I want to read a poem called Woodland U. It's easy to look at the contours of a forest and feel a bone deep love for nature. It's less easy to remember that the contours of your own body represent the exact same nature. The pathways of your mind, your dreams, dark and strange as sprouts curling beneath a flat rock, your regret, bitter as the citrus rot of old cut grass. It's the same, it's the same as the nature you make time to love, that you practice loving, the forest, the meadow, the sweeping arm of a galaxy. You are as natural as any postcard landscape and deserve the same love.
mm,
I reached for that poem, partly as you're asking me about spirituality, because I think for most of my life, I would have said no, that I don't think of spirituality connected to my love of nature. Um, but that's changed over time. And I think part of that change is just an understanding of my own role in meaning making. Like the story of the memoir is really the story of all those pressures we talked about kind of pushing me along a career path that felt like external validation but that didn't serve me terribly well. Um, and then reaching a low point in my mental health, one of the things I reached for was nature and returning to nature and getting back to nature and finding this sort of ineffable feeling of healing anytime I let myself just be alone in the woods. And then as a writer, thinking to myself, what is this? How do I talk about this? How do I define this for myself? And then eventually, how do I share it with others? Um, and that's a big question, right?
mm,
And I think it's a multifaceted answer. part of it at first was just that when I would go to the woods, something about being in nature lets me be quiet internally in a way that I do not feel in much of society. That the inner monologue just kind of starts to blend with the landscape for me. And I feel kind of a sense of peace that feels like it's not just coming from within me, but that it's more that I'm becoming more transparent to the landscape. Um, and all of those weird external pressures to be performative as a son or an employee or a husband, or they start to change when I'm by myself in nature, which gave me new places to stand and think about myself. Um, and then as I started to explore how I thought of meaning making, I was kind of what I might describe as sort of a grumpy atheist in college when I was younger. Like I think I was surrounded by a certain kind of evangelical Christian where it's just like, I was pushing back, kind of reactive against anything related to spirituality.
Some
So
incentive.
yeah, yeah, I was painting with a very broad brush. Um, but then, as I was thinking about how I really find healing in nature and I find ways to make meaning, I started to become more and more comfortable with using words like magic or the sacred for my own feelings, for the own meaning I found when I was in nature. Um, and it was kind of a turn for me where this can be more than one thing. This can be
Mm.
physiological, this can be brain chemistry, but it can also be how do I participate in the evolving story of my own identity as a story about myself that I tell to myself? How do I let non-human places and animals become part of that story? How do I think about what is holy or sacred, and what would be the harm in letting words like that back into my life after a long absence? Um, because I definitely felt those words even when we didn't say them. When we talked about my youngest memories of going out into the woods every day, it's like, well, we didn't go to church, except we kind of went to church because those were the sacred moments of quiet and self-reflection, were those walks in the woods with my mom. And thinking about the story of my life, it was a bunch of external pressures that pushed me away from that, and then finding kind of the calm and perspective to move back toward it.
Mm. Well, you said something interesting, like a few minutes ago. You say, the words kind of permeate through me, right? So they're coming from somewhere, right? And
Mm.
that's kind of the part of the spiritual experience, whether there is something that, like you say, physiology, biology, spirits, we can't really probably pinpoint exactly what it is, but it seems to come from something bigger than the self
Yeah.
that is intelligent, organized, that has meaning, right? And it's trying to permeate into our body, and that's where I want to go there, especially in a place that have no meaning. And the making sense of ourself is basically this infusion from something that is already making sense. Do you feel it that way a little bit?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, I tell a story in the book of turning a corner on a path and running into a great blue heron and just kind of bursting into tears. Um, making eye contact with the bird and just getting hit by just a wave of emotion, and just a new, and at the time it felt dangerous, kind of hope for my mental health journey and my future when I had spent a long string of months feeling hopeless. um, and so it's easy for me to imagine that that is not all coming from me. I mean, I often use the word sacred kind of as a sort of all-encompassing term for sort of what you're saying. There's kind of a feeling of intelligence or presence or life in a way that hmm, how to phrase it. It doesn't feel apart from me. It feels like reconnecting a limb sometimes
Mm,
when I'm out in nature, that I'm not a visitor, that that I've been sleepwalking, and that I've woken back up to a more holistic kind of reality.
mm. Yeah, so you talk about this making meaning as a skill, right?
Mhm.
An act of self-love. Uh, I've often, experienced that in nature where definitely I can recover this missing part of the self that seems to be out there and give me back a clearer reflection of who I truly am. But I'm wondering, in that experience of opening that self-love, it's not basically just a reflection of me expanding love for something bigger than the self, for
Mhm.
nature. Like me being able to feel all there is, humans and non-humans, feeling more empathy, connection, having words and feelings that comes from this experience. That love that is expanding is basically reflected back in some ways in what I call self-love. Do
Yeah.
you have that kind of experience, or how do you see that as this experience of self-love with yourself and the outer world, maybe even with your son, and all the experience of love out there, right? That reflect back to
Yeah.
us.
Yeah, I write about it a bit in the book. I have a whole chapter about kind of toxic masculinity, and I talk about one of the dangers, and it is this commodification of nature, or sort of the stuffification, right? Just seeing nature as stuff, um, to be used or killed or paved over. Um, and I think one way that that harms us is that it depopulates the world of wonders. I mean, I think when I go out and, touch a tree and think about its life and think about what this thing is and how the life there feels kindred to the life in me, that is a huge act of love and imaginative empathy and gratitude, but it's ultimately very nourishing to me. It's making the world feel more alive and wonderful and worthy of love. Um, so I think there's this bait and switch where it's like the idea that we're masters of the world, or sometimes I even see it framed as like we're an alien intelligence visiting here, this false dichotomy of nature and then whatever we are. Um, it just feels like a theft, and it's a theft from ourselves that we're not extending love to the world that made us and the world that we occupy. And yeah, my 5-year-old, it's interesting. I feel like I learn a lot from him. I'll go out in the woods with him, and he will bodily shake with excitement over seeing a bumblebee. And I think to myself, like, yep, that's it. Like, I will struggle to write that down. And he feels it just naturally. He's just born into it. Um, so I mean, in terms of him being a teacher, he just asks me questions constantly because it's all new to him. It made me laugh recently. He came and he said, "Are electric eels real?" And I thought, "Oh, what a very fair question." Boy, they sure don't sound like they'd be real, huh? It's like, yep, they're real. Like, what a cool world, huh? Um, and so it's like we know this stuff as kids, this feeling of amazement and wonder. And then I often think that the commonplace is what hides magic from us. It's this
Mhm.
familiarity that we stop thinking of it as magic or sacred, or just amazing, just shockingly amazing. And as an adult, it starts to get hid through familiarity, and then we have all of these other pressures piled on top of us. And so it really takes an act of intention to return to that thing you knew as a 5-year-old about how amazing and full of love and wonder the world is.
Mm, yeah, yeah, I miss that when I see the same thing here with a 5-year-old, and 7 months old.
Hmm.
But one of the things that also pierces through me often is the world as it is, or the world as it becoming, and the heartbreak
Hmm.
of the losses. I often think, I mean, my daughter is 7 months old. Uh, I don't know if when she'll be in her 20s, she'll be able to see, the glaciers that I'm seeing in Peru when I visit the Andes.
Yeah.
I know there are many species that are, probably on the verge of extinction that won't be there when she'll be in a teen even. I want to ask you about that because as fathers, I'm sure you're connected to that, right? At least I do, and I'm sure you do. How do you navigate the losses, the heartbreak with the depths of the empathy and the connection and the
Yeah.
depression that is lingering?
I mean, the best word I have for it is honesty. I mean, I think telling, I'm going to tell my son the truth as best I can, um, about the flawed human animal and, where we've lost wisdom and how injustice is alive and well and self-serving ignorance. And, there are things we can do. But as somebody who struggles with major chronic depression, the thing I have to come back to again and again is accepting what I do and do not control. Like, it's there's a lot of room for grief and there's a lot of room for anger in my life, but I also have to extend some empathy to myself and take some time to say, all right, acknowledge what you do and don't control, and acknowledge that the good in the world and the evil in the world are always happening simultaneously. And so, in a world like ours that is so connected and information is so available, you can spend every moment of every day looking toward a worthy injustice, something that is worthy of our attention or fear or rage or grief. We know that. That's absolutely possible. But something about my love of nature and my understanding that I'm a part of nature says, all right, but I am also worthy of moments of wonder and love and joy and peace. And in a world where all of this information is available simultaneously, it's going to take an act of intention to say that sometimes I need to turn toward the good and the peaceful and the things that should be witnessed and loved. And that sometimes turning toward the good is itself an act of defiance against the evil and the losses and the grief. I think as human animals, I don't think we've ever been as far-sighted as we are now.
Mm,
And there are huge benefits to that, and there are new pitfalls to that. Um, and as somebody who's been destroyed by grief over and over again through chronic major depression, I feel like I have a bit of perspective on how to live with the grief and then how to make myself turn toward other worthy worthy things. Because obviously I have no answer for the way humans are harming our own world, but I do have some answers for how to live in that world, I think.
mm. Do you see? I mean, I see your poetry or poetry as an answer. I feel it's a pretty relevant answers. I mean, some people might feel it's completely irrelevant, but I think it's one of those medium and beauty that creates magic and empathy and emotions and love that push you or call you into uh protection of nature or supporting nature, right?
Yeah. I hope so. I That's often what brings me to the keyboard. This idea that one of the main enemies in terms of protecting nature is apathy, is disconnection, is people who have, been surrounded by modernity in a way that makes them think that nature is irrelevant. As if going inside a wooden box and shutting a door somehow removes you from the world, right? Um, but I think there's a huge call for poets and storytellers, because I think one of the things that's really responsible for the destruction is a failure of story. You
Mm,
know, story is a technology. Story is how we understand our place in the world. And so our current stories, our current narratives about what people are and our place in the world is largely not serving us and not serving the planet. So there have to be people who are trying to rewrite the story and, you know, improve the technology, if you will. Um, yeah, it's one of the reasons I think writing matters because as somebody who suffers from depression, the idea of being a famous writer almost will never bring me to the keyboard. But the the idea that I may be doing something of service
mm,
can get me to sit down and write on the bad days.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
you know, because part of my depression is that it's always kind of whispering in the back of my head, "Hey, what's the point?" Okay, well, I know what the point is if I'm trying to write to give people tools to reconnect to the world or to nature or to have answers for their own depression.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that. I relate so deeply in what you just shared. Um, so when we're in that moment, I'll close on that chapter here, but of at the bottom of the pit, in the despair, when the heart is broken, when we experience deep despair and grief for this world. Uh, yeah, John Macy say, you need to feel it. You need to experience that. You need to process that grief. And what's missing is this grieving process, really. But do you have a specific place or companion out there that you go to? I mean, I don't know if it's the
Mm.
heron or if it's the maple tree or the river or the specific forest. Is there this one deep friends or trusted friend out there, non-human, that
Mm.
has saved you or saved you over and over?
Yeah, I have a handful. Um, One of them that I return to a lot lately, for some reason in the winter and fall, this one stands out to me as it's a shagbark hickory tree, and it's on this crooked, muddy footpath in the sort of nature preserve park near me, place called Gallant Woods, and the tree has got to be 150 plus years old. And shagbark hickories just have this amazing ragged looking bark and bats roost in it. It's just a fascinating tree. And it's the kind of tree that feels like a landmark. And I love to go lay my hand on that tree. I love to feel it. I love to lean against it. I love to stand in its presence. And that's part of it. But another part of it is what it takes to get to it because it's in an inconvenient place. uh, you know, there's this broad, deep stream with rocks that are slippery that I have to go over, and it's muddy, and I end up churning all of these leaves into the ground, and and then it's surrounded by these hickory nut hulls, and there are fox squirrels and gray squirrels and red squirrels, and part of visiting that shagbark hickory for me is all of the things that I will see along the way to visit it. So when I visit the hickory, it's partly about the tree, but it is also what I am committing to in getting to the tree. It's the journey there and the journey back, and that somehow in my mind is part of the character of the tree.
Hmm, that's beautiful. Okay, we're getting close to the end, but I would love you to pick up another, text from your beautiful writing. And then I want to talk about hope and the future before we close. If there is something inspiring, or even it can be heartbreaking, in fact, we can bounce back between those two feelings.
Yeah, let me look for a minute here.
There was this moment where, for me, it's the oak tree, where there's this 300-year-old oak tree, probably, I don't know, maybe more on our land, and is at a almost horizontal angle. I don't know, it might be 25 degrees above ground, but it's been growing that way forever. But for me, it's reminders that, yeah, sometimes we're maybe on the edge of falling, but we can become strong in there and still age well and create some
Yeah.
beauty. And I definitely love the hickory bark tree. That's rugged terrain there. Yes.
Let me read a little bit of a chapter in my new book. It's the chapter called Lightning Bugs, but it's about making room for whimsy in our lives, like imaginative fun in our relationship with nature and ourselves. Um, Something about what's in the air right now feels like this is a good thing to remind folks of. The truth is, I need whimsy to live. I suspect many of us do. I need to wander through insectile constellations and fields beneath the dull copper glow of a summer sunset. I need to chat with maple trees and share meaningful moments with herons. I need to see myself as a dark, warm wilderness through the perspective of my gut bacteria, or an inscrutable striding giant through the senses of a jumping spider on my kitchen counter. These are whimsical imaginings, but important all the same. Important because perspective informs our reality, and our choices inform our perspective. Choosing fun and wonder isn't an impractical, passive escape. It is a valuable, active method for enriching our days, an intentional way to invest ourselves in the premise that life is rich and worth our attention and effort. I need to zoom in to the swirl of my fingerprints and see them as a living map of galaxies, or zoom out and see the water in my body as part of a continuous, abstract river flowing from storms over blooming meadowlands down to a midnight seabed where giant spider crabs pace the darkness beneath darting flashes like living lightning. Bioluminescence from creatures they do not name, while high above whale shadows drift across the liquid sky like passing clouds. There is a dim, gray cavern at the center of me that is neither lit nor warmed by practicality, but whimsy can build a bright hearth there and make it into a home, both for myself and for those who would enter my life. It is the furthest thing from frivolous. I think that little section is really about giving people permission to be playful in the way they engage both with their own lives and with nature. Because there's a lot of grim news. There is, and there is a time of grief. Um, but I think one important part of the recipe and the way forward is for people to see nature as a source of joy and meaning and hope, not something that they only turn to grieve or to feel the heaviness, but as something that is in itself medicinal and joyful and wonderful and something very much worth our attention and worth our effort to save.
Mm, yeah, can feel that very deeply. Thank you for that, Jared. Before we close, are you writing a new book? I mean, I know you just published one, but what's next? Are you looking just at writing, or I know you also have a beautiful podcast, and we mentioned all that below this talk here, but what are you dreaming
Yeah.
of? What's the dream at the moment?
I just completed a naturalist course here in Ohio. I'm volunteering more. I have a fourth poetry collection that's getting close to being finished. Um, and I just sold a novel about a guy who runs away to the Catskills
Oh,
and
right,
encounters some
right
strange
here.
nature there. Yeah, yeah. Uh, so that'll be out in 2027. So I'm always writing and I'm always making time to get out into nature. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Jared. So for everyone who's been listening, please, go check some of this amazing collections of nature poetry from Jared. The Field Guide to the Haunted Forest, Love Notes from the Hollow Tree, and Leaf Litter, and his memoir, Something in the Woods Loves You. And I have to say, I really just love the title, and maybe you're just inspired by listening the title. But I have to just point out to that before I close. I say in your bio, it's finished by Jared lives in Ohio between a park and a cemetery. And I was just even your bio, just the end of it was very poetic there. You feel the tension between, is that the aliveness on the desk there, right?
I do, and the cemetery next to my house is also an arboretum with the tree species labeled. So I find that very appropriate as a final return to nature. So yeah, I find it to be a very peaceful place, honestly.
Thank you so much, Jarod.
Thanks, dear. Really nice to be with you.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.